is friendship. And I embrace the friendship here. And Josephina will introduce Alain. Louder.
Hello. It's okay? The sound? Seems so, no? Okay, so I'm Josefina Ayerza, the editor of Lacanian Inc. Let me thank you all for being here tonight, and a very special thanks to Jack Tilton for his keen desire in hosting these Lacanian Inc. launching events. Issue 28 is on profane illuminations. I borrowed the topic from one of Jacques Alain Badiou's articles in this same issue. Here, the profane in the way of illumination will get articulated throughout a succession of binary oppositions, which he wants superimposed. The first opposition brings up the symptom and the symptom. Then Miller comments on truth and jouissance as the second opposition at once made apparent. I quote, "Since the symptom affects everything, except a decoding of truth." How so? This is Lacan's symptom to designate the incurable, to compensate for the lack of sexual relation. As the symptom stops making signs, it will become a name of symptom. Now you structure around it. The parallel with M, the murderer, in the Fritz Lang film is quite rewarding. To start with, a supplement function of the symptom is simply imposed. Louder, please. Hello, like this? Maybe closer. Okay. So we were saying, the character cannot have sexual relations with women. Therefore, he strangles little girls. Although he goes through real and authentic suffering while accomplishing his crimes, the ones to primarily suffer his symptom are the others, his victims, their families. That is, his suffering, nevertheless authentic, is yet impotent to obstruct the jouissance. Let's say there is the symptom's diabolic satisfaction. What makes a sign for M is the little music that accompanies his wandering. It announces the death that only the blind beggar can hear, for certain not charmed by the jouissance of vision. It is the sign of the symptom. Also the letter M that gets written with white chalk on his back marks him. He sees on the window of the toy shop. M stands for murderer, the name of his symptom, yet his name of the accursed, since it is the others to give him this name. The pervert wants the other to jouir. His jouissance is the jouissance of the other, different from the neurotic, in which case it is himself to give a name to himself. As a third instance, we have the dichotomy opposing desire and drive. There too, only desire can be decoded, but the drive cannot be decoded. Here Miller brings in the touché and the automaton that Lacan sets forth in Seminar 11. Lacan borrows the touché from Aristotle, who uses it in his search for cause. And he translates it at the encounter with the real. The real is beyond the automaton, the return, the coming back, the existence of the signs by which we see ourselves governed by the pleasure principle. And he aligns the lack and the whole, the lack of a signifier as opposed to the central whole of the ball of string, is what Again, the Latin being, which defines the Lacanian subject, he superimposes to the being of the symptom. I quote, "The subject is a punctual and fading function, a position which does not imply any being, but rather a deduction, since the par lettre disposes of a much more important foundation." His last position, the phantasma and the body, reads in the usage we make of the phantasma, barring us from the term for the body and its instance. Slavoj Žižek, in his letter, which did arrive at its destination, calls upon the drama of an annoying father, as well as a deceiving father, and its universal character. Here is a story. Hanif Kureishi was telling Žižek about his new novel, and this time the narrative is different from what he wrote before. Thus, he ironically asked Kureishi, I quote, "But the hero is nonetheless an immigrant with a Pakistani father who is a failed writer." Kureishi replied, "What's the problem? Do we not all have Pakistani fathers who are failed writers?" According to Žižek, Kureishi was right, since this is what Hegel meant by singularity elevated into universality. Therefore, the pathological twist that Kureishi experienced in his father is part of every father. There is no normal father. Everybody's father is a figure who failed to live up to his mandate, and thus left to his son the task to settle his symbolic debts. As to the profane with regard to the cover by a young Argentinian artist, let's say that it evokes the ancient Greek in the figure of the god Priapos. In his dedicated essay, Richard Payne Knight sustains that men, considered collectively, are at all times the same animals, employing the same organs and endowed with the same faculties. Therefore, their passions, prejudices, and conceptions will be formed on the same principles. With Priapos, the principle at stake is the phallus, the image of the male sexual organ. Through the centuries, the actual image results in a signifier. Now, because it is a signifier, it touches a desire, which we know with Lacan belongs solely in the very human. Alain Badiou with us tonight is contributing to Lacanian 28, his famous article, Joy. This article has a story which not even Badiou knows much about. It starts with Jack Tilton telling me that Richard Tuttle had been at a Badiou lecture in in London, right? And marveled at what Badiou said at the occasion. This is why I called or maybe wrote to Badiou asking for the very article. And that is why I was so happy when he said I could have it. In drawing, every work of art is a description without place. Again, space gets to speak outside itself. Now, some trace without place creates as its place an empty surface. What to say of his the formulas of the real? For certain, it is something to decode, and he's here with us, so we let him do it himself. With you, Alain Badiou.
It's good?
Yes.
No. So, technology is good. It's the first part. After that, we can say for thinking. I begin by a very general question. What are finally the relationship between artistic creation and philosophy? It's a long story, and it's sometimes the story of a war. You know, at the very beginning of the story, you find Plato, which is saying that between philosophy and poetry, there exists, I quote him, a very old war. So, at the end of the story, we find, for example, Heidegger. And for Heidegger, it's the contrary. Philosophy is finished, metaphysics is dead, or dying for a long time, but it's like a corpse. And poetry is really something which is in its very essence near being as such. And so it's just finally a strange tale. At the beginning, something like a very difficult war between artistic creation and philosophy. At the end, something like a promotion, véritable, something completely new on the side of artistic creation and against philosophy itself. Perhaps the difficulty is first to understand the problem of the definition of artistic creation by philosophy. And it's not a simple task, because naturally, artistic creation exists by itself. It's not something which exists after philosophy, or by philosophy, or across philosophy. There is an independent existence of artistic creation. But philosophy, as Deleuze says, is creation of concepts. And so the question is, what is finally the philosophical concept of artistic creation? I think, to clarify this problem, that there exist two great tendencies concerning the philosophical definition of art, or more specifically, of artistic creation. Two great tendencies and a third position, which you can imagine is by chance mine. The first position is to define artistic creation by its relationship to something else. It's a very strong tendency in a philosophical framework to say that there is no complete independence of artistic creation, but that we must define artistic creation by its relationship to something else. And you perfectly know the different possibilities of that sort of definition. First, artistic creation is imitation. So, imitation of something else. And there is a long tradition where artistic creation is in fact imitation of nature. And nature is something like an ideal for artistic creation itself. We have to do something hard, beautiful, as extraordinary, as divine, as nature. It's the first possibility. The second possibility is that artistic creation is sublimation, transformation of affects, or drives, or patience of the subject. And so the real material, if you want, of artistic creation is something like the living body or the living being, more generally speaking, with its affects, its drives. And artistic creation is something like a new formalization of all that. Something which transforms drives, affects in something like a form. And in this case, the fundamental relationship by which artistic creation is defined is the relationship to something like the background of subject, the profound background of subjectivity. And the third case is not exactly sublimation, but expression. Expression of the self, or expression of social groups, or expression of some differentiated cultures. And in this case, artistic creation is also in relationship to something else, which is the great framework of human differences. Differences between cultures, differences between sexes, differences between myself and the other. And the real framework for artistic creation is something like the great complex of all differences which constitute the destiny of human being. So imitation, sublimation, expression, in all these cases, artistic creation is defined philosophically by its relationship to something else. And it's the first possibility. We can probably name it the classical possibility in a very large sense of the word classical. The second trend, if you want, the second orientation, is to define artistic creation by its effects, its action on the subject, or more generally, its action in the world itself. Artistic creation is really the creation of something new, which is a transformation of something in the world itself, in the reality. And so, artistic creation is not completely independent, because its measure, if you want, is precisely the effects, the real effects of artistic creation upon something else, precisely. And there is two great traditions, philosophically speaking, along this line. First, the effect of arts is the coming of the infinite idea, infinite forms. It's a relationship between the infinite, or if you want, the absolute, and the world of finite forms. And we can speak of this possibility as the romantic one. In the romantic conception of art, art is defined by the relationship between the absolute, or the infinite, and the world of finite forms. And finally, the artist, as such, is like a mediation between infinite horizon of thinking and reality of finite forms. We can say that in that sort of orientation, artistic creation is in relationship with absolute truths. Absolute truths, which are, if you want, the absolute truth. And there is something like a rivalry between art and religion. Art is something like a religion without God or without a narrative or a fiction concerning the existence of God. It's a direct relationship, an intuitive relationship, and a creative relationship to the infinite idea. And so I insist, the artist is really a mediation. So it's something like the Christ. There is something which is sacred in artistic creation. But there is another possibility, more modest, if you want, which is that the special effect of artistic creation is pleasure and nothing else. That finally the real goal of artistic creation is pleasure, and more specifically, pleasure of harmony. Creation of pleasure by a new harmony. Harmony in the world itself. We can speak of a cosmic harmony, the creation of a new body which is like the creation of a cosmic harmony, a thing of beauty. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. You know? A joy forever is joy in a profound sense. Joy like a new harmony of thinking and nature. And joy is the very definition of artistic pleasure. And another possibility is a subjective harmony, a creation of subjective harmony. You find something like that in Kant, in the aesthetic of Kant, where artistic pleasure is something like an harmony between the different subjective faculties, between the imagination and rational faculty, or more generally between all human faculties. And beauty, the experience of beauty, is the experience of subjective harmony between completely different human faculties. And so it's not a cosmic harmony, it's not a new truth in the world, but it's something like a discovery of the truth of the subject itself. Without artistic creation, the subject is disunified. There is really different possibility and different faculties. And there is a gap, for example, between imagination and action, or between action and knowledge. And the reconciliation between the great faculties is properly the action of the arts. And so the pleasure of harmony can be a cosmic harmony, can be a truth in the world, or can be the truth of the subject as such. But to summarize all this clear classification, we can say that in every case, artistic creation is fundamentally in relationship with something else. Absolute idea, harmony of faculties, of subjective faculties, absolute truth, expression of the self, or culture, or social groups, affects, drives, nature. You have all that, which are references, fundamental references of artistic creation. And it is at this moment that I propose my own definition, which is, in natural way, not absolutely new. In philosophy, you know, there is never something absolutely new. It's a word dormant. We have to create something absolutely new. In fact, it's impossible. There is always something which is, to speak like Nietzsche, the return of the same. And you know, it was the conception, the conception of my master, Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser was always saying that there is no history of philosophy. Philosophy is a succession of acts, of delineation, of interventions, and finally, it's always something like the possibility of an idealistic way against the possibility of a materialist way. And you can refine all that, you can say that is my own concept and so on, but finally it's a repetition. And because I hope to be completely in repetition, I propose to say that philosophy is something like a creative repetition. And everybody is satisfied. On one side, because we accept to say that it is real, that philosophy is repetition. There is something like the same gesture, if you want, in philosophy, to separate, to distinguish. So that is the repetition of this life. But there is also something which is really creative and which concerns, in fact, the concept, the context of the repetition, the framework of the repetition, the material elements of the repetition. And so we have to do with something new in art, something new in science, something new in love, and so on. And so the best image is probably a musical one, theme and variations. It's always the same theme, the return of the same, but there are really interesting variations. So I propose a variation. You have to say if it is interesting, it's another problem. But I propose a variation. My definition is that we cannot completely understand artistic creation without saying that it's not, the very essence of art are not in relationship to something else. That is finally that artistic creation is really something independent. Something which cannot be defined in philosophical terms from a point which is distant of itself, like nature, absolute idea, harmony of the subject, and so on. But the possible idea is to say that in this case, artistic creation is something like a reflection of itself, if it's something completely independent. The natural idea is to think that artistic creation is a reflection of itself, and that finally the history of the art are the history of the consciousness of what is artistic creation. And you know, it's a really important modern idea that the history of artistic creation is the history, a reflexive one, and that the true subject of art is art itself. And that finally we have to propose new forms, not as new form of something else, or for something else, but new forms across them is said that there is a new reflexive determination of the gist of art. The gesture in art. We have here in a difficult meditation, and I hope we have to do something like a collective meditation concerning this point in that sort of place. Is there a relationship between the idea of a reflexive history of arts and the idea of the end, of the death of arts? That is probably our most important and difficult question. It seems that the history of avant-garde during the last century has been the history of something like a close relationship between the idea of reflexivity, new forms where something is said concerning the very essence of the arts, and the idea of the death of art as such, and the transformation of the arts into something like a direct expression of life. And is there really a close relationship, that sort of close relationship? There is something other in terms of possibility in the reflexive conception of the history of art, than finally the idea that the arts are finished. And there is, for the philosopher, a clear comparison with the history of metaphysics. Because we know that for Heidegger and many others, the history of metaphysics is finally today the history of the death of metaphysics, or of the deconstruction of metaphysics. You can choose the word that you want. And the question of the death of metaphysics is also the question of its reflexive destiny. Because the category of the subject, the Cartesian category of the subject, is precisely the idea of a new reflexive stage in the history of metaphysics. But finally, it's the last stage, it's the end. When you are in the conviction that an history is always the history of the reflexive determination of the thing, you are probably in the conviction that the death is very near, that we are very near the death. Or the dying, and the difference between dying and death, it's a very complex one. So, my hypothesis, I propose to you, is that if you abandon the relationship between artistic creation and something else as an external reference, nature, subject, and so on, maybe God too. If you substitute to the idea of an external reference the idea of reflexive destiny, and that the contemporary sequence of the existence of art is finally the existence of a reflexive determination, of a formal determination of the art as such, you have, by necessity, you do finally, by necessity, something like a gesture of the end. And you have, naturally, because this end is dying and not exactly death, you have to repeat the gesture itself. You have to organize the death by successive, more and more radical artistic gesture. And so we have a choice here. We have a choice. Certainly, I agree with the idea that we have to abandon the external reference. But I disagree with the reflexive consistency. And so there is only one possibility. The possibility is that artistic creation is the production of a new truth. And the specific production of a new truth, which is not a truth in relation with something else, which is not a truth which is possible in another field than artistic creation itself, but which is not a truth concerning only art as such, which is not a reflexive truth. That is the general idea. The general idea is that contemporary arts are in fact a productive space or a productive framework in which we can find some new truths, which are truths not in a reflexive form, not in a relationship to something else, but which are new truths by themselves, like new scientific truths or new political sequence and so on. So we have to clarify two things, 2 points. First, what is exactly a production? If production is not immediately in something like an economic paradigm, if you want. If production is something like really a creation. What is production? What is the specific production in artistical field? And after that, second point, truth, maybe, but truth, what is the difference of the artistic truth? Why something exists like artistic truth, which are different from other truths, from other production of thinking, of other production of human being. And so the theory we have to propose is first a theory of production, and after that a theory of truth as different truths, and not as general, unified, or transcendent truths. So it's not a return to the absolute idea, it's not a return to relationship to nature or something like that, but it's not the idea of a reflexive or critical destiny. If it's true that arts are production of a truth, we have a vision which is completely affirmative. That is a point of possibly something to be polemics. The function of artistic creation is not a critical one. And why? Because if art is only in a function of critical nature, it cannot be really the production, the affirmative production of a new truth. So we have also a choice between an affirmative conception of artistic creation today and a negative conception, which is conception of arts are deconstructive procedures, critical of society and so on. Some points concerning all that. I cannot, explain all the constructions, but some limited points. First, concerning production. By production, I think something like a process which begins by an event and which organizes the consequences of this event. This process is also the creation of a new body. A new body that is the inscription of the consequences of the event in a concrete and real world. And the orientation of this new body is a new form of subjectivity. So if you want, we have the connection, the relationship between four major concepts. First, event, naturally, which is the beginning of the sequence. Consequences, c'est-à-dire a new logical framework for the consequences, artistical consequences of the event. New body as something which is the materiality or the real of all that, and new subjective form. One example of all that. A musical one, if you want. At the end of the 19th century, we have something like a Schoenberg event. That is a proposition that it is possible to write music without any reference to tonality, to classical tonality. Okay. That is, so 2 or 3 first attempts of Schoenberg constitute the event as such. It's something like a choice, a pure risk. Maybe it's something new, maybe it's something like a failure. Before the event as such, we don't know. But you see that it's a rupture at the, concerning the relationship between what is a form and what is not a form. That is exactly the place for an event. You displace the relationship between form and non-form or inform. And all artistical event is always something like that, a displacing of the limit between form and non-form or inform. And for example, with Schoenberg is proposing that some musical configurations are acceptable as forms, but before they are not at all acceptable as forms. They are purely inform. And today, too, there are many people who say that it's not a form, the Schoenberg attempt. and that the only musical form, finally, is the tonality. And so the rupture, the nature of the rupture is always to displace, to move, if you want, the limit between form and inform, and in my example, in the musical case. Consequences. After that, Schoenberg, and after Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, and some others, a long list with Boulez, Stockhausen, and some others, have to organize the consequences of the event. The event is something like a rupture, like a cut. But after that, you have to do music. And for doing music, you have to propose new rules. So the consequences of the event are always the construction of a new system of rules which are, if you want, compatible with the event, compatible with Schoenberg event. And across these new rules, you have the constitution of what I name a new body. What is a new body? A new body is something like a new music. Not only 2 or 3 decisions of Schoenberg alone, but the construction of a long history of a new space for music itself. So it's a new music, but a new music which exists with its rules, its definitions, its history, and so on. And today we name all that contemporary music. After 1 century of existence. It's a very strange case. That contemporary music is the name of the new body. And I think it's really a new body. If after 1 century, we can always say that it's contemporary music. So that is the question of the new body. And after that, we have something like an orientation. The new body is the new music, but we have new creations inside the new music. So we have also the necessity of a new relationship to music itself. Because if you have in the old musical subjectivity, you have in the idea that all that is without form at all. And in fact, it's the position of a great number of people today. So, with the new body, if you want a new public, if you want something which is really collective, we have to create something like a new orientation, a new subjective understanding of what is music. In the old understanding of what is music, we cannot have an access to the new musical world. And it is why we have finally, in fact, event, Schoenberg event, consequences, new music, from atonalité to surrealism, in fact. After that, a new orientation, a new subjectivity, that is really a new manner to understand what is music. That is a new manner to understand what are the limits between what is a form and what is not a form at all. So, what is the difference between music and noise? A new difference between music and noise. Okay, so what we can name in all that the production, specifically, the production of truth. I name production of a truth the complex of the event, the consequences, the new body, and the new subjectivity. All that create a new world. A new world, naturally, not in general, but a new world in the musical field. It's really a new musical world. And so, production of a truth is finally production of a new world. A new world with, inside this world, new bodies and new subjectivity. And why I name all that a truth? Because it's a truth concerning the relationship between form and non-form, not in-form. It's something which says that we can displace the limits of the form without falling in the inform. And so it's finally a new truth concerning the relationship between the sensible as such, sounds, colors, lines, and so on, bodies, and the general question of forms. That is the general question of the action of human being in the sensible world. Because art is fundamentally an action, a production of something in the sensible world. And something like the creation of a new musical world is something like the creation of a new truth concerning a very old philosophical problem, which is what exists in fact of relationship between the sensible, the pure experience, the pure beauty of the world as such, or the pure non-beauty of the world as such, and the forms that we can create artificially. And so, a truth in the artistical field is always something like a new mixture of pure sensibility and something like a formalism. And sometimes the question of formalism is the most important one. Sometimes the question of the immediate access of the sensibility to the world is the most important side. It's a question of sequence. It's a question of the nature of truth. It's an historical one. It's an historical question. But more generally, an artistical truth, because it is the displacing of the limit between form and inform, says something concerning the world itself, concerning the real. That is precisely the possibility for our action, our creative action, to dispose the sensible as such in another manner with new relation to forms. And my example was very clear, if you want. After Schoenberg, after the Schoenberg event, with the new body, the new world, and the new subjectivity of contemporary music, we have something which is said concerning the relationship between sounds as such, the universe of sounds, and the question of form. And during a long sequence, the result of all that is some disposition of musical tonality. But after the event, the Schoenberg event, it's something else. So it's a new truth. And we have to understand that the truth is always something new. It's a rupture with the old idea that the truth is always to recognize something which is here. No, the truth is always a creation or an action, and we cannot have any idea of a truth before its production. So a truth is something which is created, but I propose to say that it's also something which is eternal. So it's a creation in the time, at the point of a time, but it's something which is eternal in a very empirical sense, which is eternal in time, because it's a new possibility for creation and thinking. And this possibility is a possibility for everybody. It's a purely universal possibility. For example, the new musical world created after the Schoenberg event is a musical possibility, which is a new relationship between sounds and forms. There is no necessity to do the same thing, but it is forever a new possibility, because it has been proved that we can accept as new form that sort of construction of sounds, which before was not acceptable at all. And in that sense, you have something like an eternal destiny of a truth. And it's a complex idea, because the idea of eternity in its classical form is eternity as something which is absolutely apart the time, which is after the time or before the time, or which is not, cannot confusing with time. But by eternal truth, in artistical creation, but in other creations too, by eternal truth, I name something which is in time, because it has been created not only in a point, in a moment of time, but also in a concrete world. After all, the Schoenberg event was an event in Europe, in Vienna, and so on. It was purely localism. So we have the question of the birth of something eternal in a very precise conditions of space and of time. You know, it's an idea of Descartes, a classical idea of Descartes. Descartes has proposed, I think for the first time, the idea of creation of eternal truths. The creation of eternal truths. And enemies of Descartes was saying that this idea was completely absurd. If it is eternal, it cannot be created. And if it is created, it cannot be eternal, clearly. And Descartes was very obstinate concerning this point. No, we have to say that eternal truths, for example, 1 and 1 made 2, are created. In the case of Descartes, it's created by God, naturally. And the idea is that the productive capacity of God cannot be limited. So we cannot say it's true, so it's true also for God. No. God creates all things, and he creates also truths, and eternal truths. My idea is to do the same thing without God. And it's much more difficult, because God is a very useful philosophical trick. But it's possible. It's possible precisely if we understand that by eternal, we have to conceive something which is in time and in space, a new possibility, a new universal possibility in the creative field concerned. And once more, when there is really creation of a new historical body and a new subjective orientation concerning the relationship between forms and inform in any sensible field, we can say that this possibility is something eternal. And naturally, it's something created, something new. It depends of an event. And by definition, an event cannot be calculated. So there is something absolutely contingent. Like when God says, okay, 2 and 3, it's 5. It's the example of Descartes. But it's possible for God to say that 2 and 3 is 6. It's difficult to understand for us, but not for God. Because it creates the truth. And my vision is maybe more simple, more rational. It's a mixture of the idea of a contingent creation, contingent decision, like the Schoenberg event, after a long sequence of musical cohesion, and the conviction that the consequences of the event are organized like a new universal possibility. You can do like that. You know that it's possible to consider as a form something which be possibility. It's a determinate creation with event, choice, construction, art construction of a new spiritual body, if you want. But it's also the creation of a new possibility. And maybe the most important point, and it will be my conclusion, the most important point is to completely understand what is a new subjectivity, what is the orientation of the body. Because it's probably the difficulty of artistic creation today. In my example, for instance, there is something like a gap between the clear existence of the new musical world and the difficulty of creation of the new adequate subjectivity in this world. There is something more and more closed. And the closure of all that is not a failure. Certainly there is something like a new musical world. There is also some other musical worlds in this precise example. But what is really the new subject of all that? And why it's so difficult to recognize at a very important level the existence of this new musical subject. Contemporary music, difficult, hard, contemporary music after 1 century of existence. You know that it's a subjective question, not an objective one, because the new music exists. To understand this point, we have to clarify the question of the subject in general, but more precisely, the question of the plurality of types of subjectivity. Because when we have a new world, when we have a new body and a new subjective orientation in an artistical field, we have also a reaction. We have also a new negation of the new. And it's very important to understand this point. The novelty is also the novelty of the negation of novelty. There is always some new forms of subjectivity which are reactive in consideration to the new forms of subjectivity. And so we have the creation of new forms of negation. It's not only the failure of the affirmation, it's a struggle. It's a struggle not only between what is new and what is old, what is critical and what is conservative, what is the new world of music and what is the repetition of the old world. It's not only that. It's in fact a more profound struggle between two types of subjectivity, one which is defined by faithfulness to the event, so development of the consequences of the event, interiorité or immanency to the new body, new positive subjective orientation, and the other, which I name the reactive one, which is something like the refusing of the new world, but not the refusing of the new world by all means, but also by new means. And it's also a political question. In the political field, maybe the comparison is more clear. In political field, we have always to think that when there is a new political proposition, a new political sequence, we have also a new form of reaction, against it. And so the struggle is not reducible to the struggle between the new and the old, or between revolution and conservative trend. But it's a struggle between a new affirmation and a new negation of this affirmation. And the potency of creation is also the potency to create new enemies. You create something new, but you create also new enemies of the something new. And in fact, we can perfectly see in the story of contemporary music the progressive creation and displacement of new enemies of the new musical world. And it's not only to say, oh, the old music was so beautiful, the new music is so difficult to hear. No, it is new arguments, new negation, new means to be reactive against the novelty. And it will be my final declaration. We have probably today also to identify clearly what is the new negation. Not only what is the new affirmation, the new artistical trend, the new creative possibility, but also where are the new enemies. And it's the same thing in artistic creations and in political creation today. There is something obscure in the question of enemies. There is something obscure in the question of negation. What is the new negation? I think the recent history of United States is very interesting concerning this point. Because we have the experience, the concrete experience of the Constitution inside the story of the country itself, but we know something like that in France in another manner, of something which apparently can be described as old forms of reactionary, eternal reactionary, if you want, but in fact as something new. And their efficiency is not only in their old fashion, but much more in their new style. And artistical field is always the artistic field of a struggle. But this struggle today is probably an obscure one. It's my hypothesis, and something that I submit to your discussion. We know precisely what are the new artistical orientations where there is something like some event where we organize consequences faithful to novelty. We know that something like a new subjectivity exists. But there is something obscure in the new forms of negation of all that. What is their way? What is their means? What is the novelty of negation itself? It's always dangerous to be surprised by enemies. It's a rule of war. And maybe it's a possibility today to be more and more surprised by unknown enemies, obscure enemies. And it's for that I propose the formal distinction between finally three types of subjectivities. Three types of subjectivity. We have that in the paper. It's a mysterious paper, but I don't explain it. It's forever. Yes, and my goal is only to very quickly clarify the question of subjective types. Before the first part, 3 letters, is perfectly clear. Event, body, and present. The name present, in the name, the word present, you recognize the complex of the body and the subjective orientation, something like that. Present is also the same thing as the eternal. It's a very old idea in the philosophical theory of time. The pure present is something eternal. So new present signifies also something like a new possibility, which is eternal. I don't comment for the moment the operation. Implication is in its usual sense, consequences, logical consequences, and negation also. So I go immediately to the third part, 3 subjective types. Faithful, reactionary or reactive, and dark. Or you can work concerning the formulas after all. But the general idea is not so complex, and the formula are not so complex when you have the letter and the relation. See. First type, the faithful type, which is the more evident, is the subjective type, which is really inside the construction of the new body and inside the construction of the new world, which is the same thing like the new present. So, in my example, it's the concrete existence of the new musical subjectivity after the Schoenberg event. That is the faithful type, faithful to the event, in fact, faithful to the consequences of the new situation, faithful inside the construction of the new aesthetical body, if you want. Reactionary or reactive is a subjective type which naturally is contemporary of the faithful type. It was my idea just before. The act of the reactionary type, subjective, is always the negation of the event. Finally, it's something like that. It's very simple. Is to say there is no event at all. What you are saying concerning the new world, with an event as its beginning, it's nothing new, it's a fiction. And we can have a present, a production of a present, without the reference of the event. And it is why I name this present an extinguishing present, an extinguished present. A present which is not really in the strength of the present, or a present which is not eternal. The specific production of the new negation, which is always negation of the event as such, because the event is the first support of novelty, the production of that sort of subjectivity is a present, but a present without presence. A present which is something like an obscure present, a present which is not in the light of the present, or a present which is not eternal. And why? Because without the event, we are only the continuation of the old world, naturally. So the negation of the event is also the promotion of a present which in fact is the past. But by new means, the means of a new negation, we precisely the negation of the event. And we have to, the reactionary subjectivity has to create the new means for this negation. If you have to have negation of Schoenberg event, or of a French Revolution, or of May 68, or something like that, you have to create new forms, new means for the negation. Because the negation of something new is also a new negation. Okay. And the result of all that is something like a present, which is exactly the same thing as the past. And there is a third type. The third type, which I name the dark subject. The dark subject is something completely different of the reactive one. The dark subject is the general idea that there is no event at all, because we have an infinite and eternal body. We have a great sea without crossing out. And this great sea, which is in fact the only event, a fundamental event, an event of all possible events, is properly the negation, the structural negation of all affirmation of novelty. So the dark subject is not creation of a new negation, but is the structural negation of all novelty. And it's not a reactionary position. It's a fanatic one. It's a fanatic one which has at its goal the destruction of all new present. And it is why in the formula, the present is under the line, is the repression of the present as such. So we have finally three positions, if you want. In the details, it's much more complex, in fact. But I don't give the details immediately. But you understand. The three types are concerning, finally, what is a new world or a new present. In the faithful type, we have the idea of the creation of a new present as something which has a new possibility is eternal. So we recognize the event, we work with the trace of an event, we create by fragment a new body, and you have as a result a new world, a new present. The reactive or reactionary subject is the negation of the event as a new negation. So it's contemporary to the faithful subject. And it's the field concerning the struggle for novelty between the faithful type and the reactionary time. And the production of the reactive type is not that there is no new present, but that there is a very good new present, which is the past. And so it's not the complete negation of the present, but it's the idea that we can continue the last present. And so it's something like a conservative position. And the dark subjectivity is that there is no new present at all. It's not a conservative position. It's a much more critical and negative and violent position. It's the idea of violently suppressing the very idea of a new present, because we have all what is necessary to life. All what is necessary exists. And so if you say that something new has to be created which is eternal, we are completely in the falsity and in the crime, because we deny that precisely we have all what is necessary in the complete and glorious great body of existence. And so, first, new present as eternal. Second, new present as past, without eternity at all. Finally, the reactive position is to deny that eternity is a necessity. We can continue. And first, dark subjectivity, violent suppressing of the idea of a new present. And it is why we have in every human being activity 4 destinations, the last line of the page. We can produce or create, it's the first possibility. We can deny, it's the second possibility. We can remove, suppress, destroy, it's the third possibility. And because the present is eternal, we can revive, we can have resurrection. So, in the artistical field, as in the other creative fields, love, politics, science, we have probably 4 great actions. And the interplay between these 4 great actions. Creation, which is always creation of a new eternal present. Negation, which is the invention of a new means for negation. Destruction, which is the act of the dark subjectivity. And resurrection. Because when a truth has been denied or has been suppressed, it's always a possibility that this truth returns. And the resurrection of the truth is very often the way for the affirmation of the possibility of a new eternal presence.